It's my very great pleasure to introduce Sara Abusarar. She's a festival favorite, a favorite everywhere she goes. And she comes from a long line of storytellers, so she comes to this honestly. On her father's side, she tells stories to both adults and children. She tells personal stories. She tells folk tales. She's told at various cultural centers and museums and art galleries all around the world. She's been invited to festivals. She would have been attending festivals in Europe as an invited teller, a guest teller this year if it hadn't been for the travel restrictions. And Sarah grew up in several countries. She tells stories from all over the world with a focus on Palestinian and Croatian stories because that's where her roots lie. Her favorite stories promote social change. She's also told stories with children in refugee camps and children in Toronto as part of therapy. She teaches stories at the Parent-Child Mother Goose program. She wins audiences over the moment she tells, and people come back again and again. You're always guaranteed a good crowd if you tell them that Sara is telling. So Sara, it's my delight and pleasure to introduce you today. We love your telling. Thank you so much. Sara also tells at the Story Tent. She also hosts the Story Tent. Come by and see her. Sara.
Thank you, Donna, for that introduction. I am unmuted. Good. Thank you for that introduction. It was very sweet. As you will hear in the following stories, I lived in many, many, many different lands as a child, 4 different continents, before I reached this beautiful land. A land that for thousands of years has been inhabited by indigenous people of this land, the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, Chippewa, and home to the Métis, and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Thank you for allowing me to share this land with you and for allowing my family to stay on this land and all the other first generation immigrants and refugees who might be in this land waiting for their homes to be available for them to go back to. Rainbow in the evening, catch your camel and ride away. Rainbow in the morning, get off your camel, rest, stay. Heaven help me, heaven save me. I refuse to marry the Bedouin's son. I'll marry the minister's secretary. In an airplane she'll fly me, and in Paris she'll serenade me. Heaven help me, heaven help save me. I refuse to marry the partying one, the one who eats prickly pears for breakfast. Heaven help me, heaven save me. I refuse to marry the one who's always praying. I'll marry the one who can drum and sing, the one who can make the music ring. There was once a king whose kingdom was vast and riches were plenty. And he had a son, and his son loved to hear stories. But he didn't have any grandchildren. And the king really wanted grandchildren to run around his kingdom, grandchildren to bring joy inside of the king's heart. But every time he asked his son, "Son, when do you plan on getting married?" His son would say, "I have not found the right person yet." And one day, as the king was looking at the children of the kingdom running around his kingdom, he looked at his son and he said, "Son, there are many princesses in the kingdom. Choose one of them." "Father, the woman that I marry does not have to be a princess." "Well, then there are many noble women in the kingdom. Choose one of them." "Father, the woman that I marry does not have to be noble." "Well, then there are many beautiful women in the kingdom, like Michelle over there, and Celia, and Rubina. Choose one of them." "Father, how shallow do you think I am? The woman that I marry does not have to be beautiful." "Well, then what does she have to be?" "She has to be smart, witty, and know how to tell stories." "Well, where am I going to find a woman like that?" "Simple. Tomorrow, throw a large party inside of our palace. Invite every single woman of the kingdom, and the woman that can tell a story that begins and ends with a lie shall be the woman that I will marry." And the next day, one by one, the women began to come inside. And one by one, they began to tell him stories. The first one stepped up. She was beautiful. Her golden braid was tilted to the side, and inside of it there was a rose. And when she spoke, her voice flowed like the river. "Kanayamakan, once upon a time." "Stop. I said I want a story that begins and ends with a lie. All stories begin with Kanayamakan, once upon a time." "Next." And one by one, he dismissed them all, until he was just about to leave when, as if she had fell from the sky, a simple young woman sat cross-legged in front of him. She had plain wavy black hair and a purple sweater, but when she smiled, the entire room lit up. And before the king even had a chance to invite her to tell her story, she began. "When my grandparents got married, I was invited to their wedding. And as their wedding gift, they gave me an egg. He was as round as a watermelon, as smooth as a baby's cheek, and as white as a moon at midnight. Well, I bounced that egg back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until the egg dropped to the ground and cracked into 2 pieces. Well, imagine my surprise when from the egg that my grandparents gave me as their wedding gift came out the largest rooster I have ever seen. Why, he was as large as a horse, and I rode that rooster as if he was a horse. I rode that rooster to faraway lands and across the mountains and into the sea. I rode that rooster so much that I didn't notice that my rooster's back was getting infected. Well, I took my rooster to a healer woman, and she said, wait until the midnight of a full moon, and then take a bit of a date and squeeze it. and then take the oil from that pit and rub it on top of the rooster's back. And I did, just as the healer woman told me. I waited until the midnight of a full moon. I squeezed that pit, I rubbed it upon my rooster's back, and then I went to sleep. The prince leaned in. The entire kingdom was now looking at the girl telling her story. And in the morning, imagine my surprise when from the rooster that my grandparents gave me as their wedding gift grew the largest palm tree that I have ever seen. And from that palm tree grew the largest, juiciest dates that I have ever seen. Well, I took some stones and I began to throw it up at the dates. One by one, the dates began to fall down. I ate the first 99 of them very slowly, savoring the taste. And I ate the last one very quickly, for a thought crossed my mind. All this time I was throwing my stones up, and indeed they were going up, but they were not coming down. Well, I decided to climb that palm tree to see where my stones had gone. I climbed that palm tree until the sun went down and the moon rose up. And then I rested upon a branch, covered myself up with some birches, and I went to sleep. And in the morning, I continued to climb up that tree until I climbed to the very top. And imagine my surprise when I found the largest, most fertile land that I have ever seen. Well, I love sesame cookies. Does anyone here love sesame cookies? Eleanor does, and Michelle and Donna, all the cool people. Well, I love sesame cookies, and I started to plant sesame seeds. I planted them right at dawn, and by noon, they were ready to be harvested. And I took 7 large bags, and I filled them to the top with sesame seeds. And then I decided to count them. And imagine my surprise when I found that one of my sesame seeds was missing. Well, I began to search for that sesame seed when I saw an ant running away with my sesame seed. Well, I ran up to that ant and I had grabbed hold of that sesame seed, and I pulled and he pulled and I pulled and he pulled and I pulled and he pulled, and the sesame seed burst open and all the oil fell to the ground, and yahoo! Now I don't only have one fertile land, I have 2 fertile lands. Well, what was I going to plant on that land? Does anyone here like watermelon? Oh, everybody here loves watermelon. Well, I planted watermelon seeds, 1 for every single person of this audience, even Eden. I planted them at noon, and by midnight, they were ready to be harvested. And there were my watermelon in a row, one after the other, all looking exactly the same. But in the middle, there was one watermelon. It was rectangular, and it was purple with pink polka dots. Well, I took my 20-meter sword and I poked at that watermelon, and I carved out a nice big triangle. And then I took it out, and there, inside of my watermelon, was a gigantic staircase. Well, I walked down those stairs, and there was a large souk. Well, there were pots and pans being sold, and jewelry and toys. And there, in the corner, was a man, and he was with his donkey. And the donkey had one of his hands behind his head, one of his legs crossed over, and in the other hand he was smoking a great big cigar. And the man, he looked frustrated. Well, I like to help people. And so I approached that man and I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "My donkey is not getting up." I said, "Grab a hold of the donkey's ears, and I will grab a hold of the donkey's tail." And I pulled, and he pulled, and I pulled, and he pulled, and I pulled, and he pulled, and the donkey's tail came right out. Well, the man was not impressed. "Help! Help! Help! Help!" Well, the police came, and they took me to jail. Yes, good people of my audience, your storyteller spent time in jail. And when I was there, the entire village gathered together to decide my fate. And in the morning, unwillingly, they brought me, and they stuffed me inside of a cannon. And they blew me all the way into the sky, and I flew, and I flew, and the world was even more beautiful from up there than it is from down below. And I bounced off of a star, floated upon the clouds, slid down the rainbow, and I landed at the prince's party. And the prince laughed and laughed and laughed. He had finally found the woman that he was going to marry. Thank you. And I also flew. I flew, and I flew, and I flew. And when I was 6 years old, I flew from Libya all the way to Yugoslavia, leaving my father behind. But once a year, in the summers, my mother, my big brother, and I, we would fly back to Libya. And my father in the summers did not live in the capital city. He lived in a small coastal town called Misurata. And his cottage was right across the street from the beach. And every day, my brother and I would wake up bright and early. We would put our bathing suits on, eat our breakfast quickly, and we would run to the beach. And we stayed there the entire day. And just before lunchtime, my brother and I would take our wooden rods that we made ourselves, and we threw it inside of the sea, and we caught sardines. And then we would run back home, take a frying pan, and my big brother and I made our own lunch. And then we ran right back to the beach. I remember one time the waves were so large that my brother and I threw our bodies into the waves, and the waves took us right back to shore. Oh, that day we swallowed mouths full of sand. Those were some happy times. But all good things must come to an end. And at the end of the summer, my brother and I had to say goodbye to our father, which was always very difficult. And one summer, just before we left, my father took my brother and I to the souk. And just like in the story, there were so many things in the souk. And my father bought me a golden necklace. And my father bought me a small stuffed dog that I named Mlito. Mlitov in Croatian means somebody who is wobbly and weak. And Lito was definitely wobbly. Well, I loved Lito so much. He became a symbol of my father. So much so that when it came time to say goodbye to my father at the airport that summer, I hugged Lito extra tight. But when we got into the airplane, I noticed that Lito was no longer there. I began to cry so loudly that half of the airplane was looking at me. And my mother said to me, "Don't worry, Sara. I will go back to the airport and I will find Lito for you." And I watched my mother as she walked past the bathrooms until I could see her no more. And then my big brother leaned close to me and he said, "Don't worry, Mama will find him." And I cried, "Don't worry, Mama will find him." And I cried, "Don't worry, Mama will find him." And I cried, "Don't worry, Mama will find him." And that orchestra went on for an entire 3 minutes, with the entire airplane now looking at my brother and me. And then my mother came back and she said, "I have some wonderful news. No, I did not find Lito, but another little lonely girl who misses her father so much. She found Lito, and Lito is now bringing joy inside of her heart." And after I heard that another little girl is being brought happiness by my Lito, the same way that he brought joy into my heart, I stopped crying, and the airplane took off, flying me across the Mediterranean Sea of Libya and towards the Adriatic Sea of Croatia. There was once an aging couple who, no matter how much they tried, and they tried, they could not have any children. And every day, as this elderly couple sat in their living room by the fireplace, the man looked at his wife and he said, "Wouldn't it be nice to have a little girl?" Any kind of child would be nice, any kind of child at all. And when it came time for pilgrimage, they took that journey. And they prayed for a child, any kind of child, any kind of child at all, even if that child's a frog. And when they returned back home, they found that God had blessed them with a little girl, but not a human little girl, but a little frog girl. How they loved their little frog girl. How she made them laugh. How they clapped when she took her first hops. And when she said her first words, which were ribbit, 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 they taught her a song. Kruška, jabuka, grožđe, kada jesen dođe, kada voće zrije, dječici se smije. And they loved their little frog girl so much that they invited the entire neighborhood to meet her. But when the people arrived, they looked at her and they snickered. "Why, your little girl is nothing but a frog." This hurt the parents' feelings. Well, they still loved their little girl, and they still took care of her. But whenever the neighbors came by, they kept her hidden inside of the closet. And so the little frog girl grew up without any little boys or any little girls to play with. She was always with her mom and dad. And every day, as her father went into the vineyard to work, and the little frog girl hopped on behind him, and while he was working, she hopped on the leaves of the orchard. And every noon, the mother brought lunch for the father. But because the little frog girl, she caught flies with her tongue the entire day, like this. Can you do that with me? She obviously wasn't hungry, and so, while her father ate, she hopped up on the top of the tree and she sang him a song. Kruška, jabuka, grožđe, kada jesen dođe, kada voće zrije, dječici se smije. And one afternoon, the prince himself was riding his white horse through that vineyard when he heard that song. He looked to the right. Nobody was there. He looked to the left. Nobody was there. Old man, who's singing that song? The old man, who was still ashamed of his little girl, said, "There's nobody singing a song. There's no song at all." And the prince continued to ride his horse all the way to the palace. But Nick, do you think that prince slept that night? No, that prince did not sleep that night. That song kept playing over and over and over in his head. It was as if he was enchanted. Kruška, jabuka, grožđe. And in the morning, when he woke up, he decided that he was going to go back to that orchard. And at exactly noon, he rode that horse through the orchard. Kada jesen dođe, kada voće zrije, dječici se smije. He looked to the right. Nobody was there. He looked to the left. Nobody was there. Old man, there is somebody singing a song. Oh, if I could find out who's singing that song, I would marry her in an instant. Are you sure about that? Of course I'm sure. I'm the prince, you know. I know what I want. And I want that girl. All right. Little frog girl, that's what he used to call her, little frog girl, come down. And the frog jumped down and bounced up into the air and down again. And she looked at them with her big frog eyes and she smiled, the kind of a smile that only a frog can smile. I know she looks like a frog, but she really is my daughter. I don't care what she looks like. She has a beautiful song, and so she is beautiful, and I will marry her. That is if she'll have me. And the frog nodded, and he looked at her and he said, tomorrow, my father, the king, he's having a gathering. He wants all three of his sons, their wives, to bring him what is the most beautiful flower of all. Can you do that? The one who brings them the most beautiful flower shall inherit the entire kingdom. And she nodded. But I'm a frog, you see. If I was to jump all the way to the palace, I would come looking so dirty. won't you bring me a rooster that I can ride to the palace? And he sent her a large white rooster. And she hopped on top of that rooster, and she rode that rooster all the way towards the sunset. And then she looked up at the sun and she said, "Oh, my goddess, won't you weave me a dress made out of your golden rays, so that I may go to the palace looking beautiful?" And the sun released its rays and wove her the most beautiful dress. She placed the dress on her arm, and then she went and she picked a strain of wheat. She placed the strain of wheat in her mouth, and then she hopped up to the sky. She kissed the sun and landed on the rooster, and she rode that rooster towards the king's palace. And when she arrived, all the guards began to look at her. Look, it's a frog riding a rooster. A frog riding a rooster. Have you ever seen anything funnier in your life? But the head guard whispered, "That frog is the youngest princess' wife." Shh! They stopped laughing. And she jumped off of the rooster. And she took that golden dress and she placed it upon her body. And she turned into a beautiful human girl. But not an ordinary beautiful human girl, but a human girl that looked just like a frog. She was short and she was stumpy, and when she walked towards that palace, she had a slight hop to her walk, much like a frog. And she stood in between the two other princesses, and she let out a big white smile, the kind of a smile that a frog might have. And the king looked at the three girls, and then he said to the eldest, "Present your flower to me." And she presented him with a red rose. "Ah, rose, the most formal flower of all. But not quite what I was looking for." And he looked at the second girl, and he said, "Present your flower to me." And she presented him with a carnation. "Ah, a carnation, not at all what a royalty wants." And he threw it behind him. And then he looked at the frog girl, and he said, "Present your flower to me." And she presented him with a stray of wheat. "Ah, this is what I was looking for. Why, you as our queen, our people will never go hungry again. Kruška, jabuka, grožđe, kada jesen dođe, kada voće zrije, dječici se smije." And last night I had a dream. And in that dream I was dancing. I danced and I twirled across the sea, and the waves carried me to my childhood home in Croatia. And there, in the corner, was my green bunny, Zeko Peko, the one that my father gave me for Easter when I was just 4 years old in Libya. The one that I loved and played with so much that his ear began to hang by a thread. The one that I carried with me from Libya all the way to Croatia. And when it was time for us to move to Canada, my mother told me that there was only enough room in the suitcase for 3 stuffed toys. I looked at Zeko Peko with his ear barely hanging by a thread. This would be too long of a journey for you to take with me. Why, if I was to take you with me, you might lose your entire ear. And so I took another toy with me, and I left Zeko Peko behind. But all these years in Canada, I always remembered Zeko Peko, but the way that he used to be with his ears intact. But last night, in my dream as I was dancing, I saw Zeko Peko as I left him with his ear hanging by a thread. I picked up Zeko Peko and I carried him to the table. I was sure that I was going to fix his ear, but I didn't do that. I looked at Zeko Peko and I said, "You are perfect the way you are. Even with your ear hanging by a thread, you are still beautiful. You are still a part of me."